Graves were being broken into in Newcastle. At first, the police thought it was simple grave robbing, jewelry, valuables, the usual. But then they realized something didn't add up, because whoever was doing this wasn't taking from the dead, they were taking the dead. In the early 1980s, something strange was happening in Newcastle. Reports began coming in about disturbed graves at Westgate Hill Cemetery. At first, police assumed it was the usual grim business, grave robbers looking for valuables. Jewelry, maybe. Something easy to sell. But then they noticed something that didn't make sense. It wasn't just valuables going missing. It was bones, missing from graves that had been sealed for over a century. Whoever was doing this wasn't just stealing, they were selecting, carefully, deliberately, and that raised a far more unsettling question. Who breaks into graves, not to take what the dead were buried with, but to take the dead themselves? As detectives began to investigate, what they uncovered would lead them away from shadowy figures in the night, and straight into a flat filled with skulls, strange symbols, and a group of young men, who weren't hiding at all. If anything, they wanted to be seen. As reports continued to come in, it became clear this wasn't an isolated incident. Similar disturbances were being reported beyond Newcastle, catching the attention of detectives in Durham. Soon, CID units from both areas began working together, trying to piece together what exactly they were dealing with. At first, the theory stayed simple. Grave robbing wasn't new. It was grim, but it was understood. But this didn't follow the usual pattern. There were no signs of valuables being taken, no clear financial motive, just carelessly disturbed graves and missing remains. And that's when the tone of the investigation began to shift. The early 1980s were a strange time. Across the globe, there was a growing fascination with the occult. Books, music, underground scenes, all flirting with ideas of black magic, ritual, and the supernatural. Some of it was genuine curiosity, some of it was media hype, and some of it was fear. It even had a name: the Satanic Panic. So when detectives saw graves being opened and bones being removed, it didn't take long for suspicions to drift in that direction, quietly at first. Then more seriously, police began making inquiries, staking out Westgate Hill Cemetery, watching and waiting, because whoever was doing this had to come back, and when they followed the trail, it didn't lead to a hidden cult deep in the woods. It led to a handful of ordinary houses in Tyneside. One of those houses stood out immediately, a flat above a chemist on Northcote Street, just up the road from the cemetery. On the surface, it didn't look like much, but even before stepping inside, there were signs that something wasn't quite right. Above the doorway hung a strange display, an imitation axe and a skull emblem, almost like a welcome sign. Just not the kind most neighbors would appreciate. Inside, things only got worse. This wasn't the regular flat of a man in his early 20s. This was something else entirely. In the living room, bones were scattered casually, as if they were everyday objects. Skulls sat on tables, others were stuffed into bags, waiting for something. In the kitchen, more remains lay out in the open, not hidden, not concealed, just there. It wasn't just disturbing, it was deliberate. And then there was the attic. As detectives climbed into the dark loft space, they were hit with the thick smell of incense. Hanging from the ceiling was a stuffed gannet suspended by string, a strange, symbolic presence like something meant to watch over the room. Further inside, they found makeshift altars, candles melted into bottles, books scattered everywhere on black magic, witchcraft, cannibalism, experimental music, even long, hooded garments, like something pulled straight out of a low-budget cult movie. At this point, it was hard to tell what they were looking at: a performance, a belief system, or just a group of people who had taken things far past the point of explanation. Either way, this wasn't just grave robbing anymore. The people behind all of this weren't some hidden cult operating in the shadows. They had names. The flat itself belonged to John Mylott, aged 21, from Northcote Street in Arthur's Hill, Newcastle. The man police would later describe as the central figure in the group. Alongside him was Alan English, 23, from Hunter's House in Walker, Newcastle. David Stewart, also 23, lived on Napier Road in Swalwell, Gateshead. Police would later find more remains, including skulls and vertebrae, and also other items were found, such as a name plaque from the graves and the group's written accounts at these houses. John Smith, 21, from Hartington Street in Arthur's Hill, was another member of the group. And the youngest, Sean Dower, aged 19, from Benwell, was still a student at Newcastle University at the time. They were 5 young men, no criminal masterminds, no secret society leaders, just ordinary lives, connected by something very far from ordinary. And strangely enough, they were also a band. They called themselves the Gentlemen of the Club, which sounds refined until you realize what their hobbies were. They were also known as Metgumbnerbone, an experimental music group creating what could only be described as ritualistic, droning soundscapes. And their instruments? That's where things take a turn, because detectives discovered that some of the bones taken from the graves hadn't just been collected, they had been modified. Thigh bones had been drilled into, turned into crude wind instruments similar to Tibetan trumpets. Skulls weren't just kept, some were used for display, others, reportedly, were turned into percussion. It's not every band that can say their instruments have a past life. In this case, several. And it didn't stop there. The group had allegedly gone as far as recording music using these instruments. Their early releases, particularly recordings like Ligelia Horn, was said to feature these bone-made sounds, creating a droning, ritualistic atmosphere that blurred the line between music and something far more unsettling. So this wasn't just experimentation in private. It was something they were willing to turn into art, something they wanted people to hear. But what made it even stranger was how they documented it all. Among the evidence was a handwritten manuscript. Not notes, not plans, a story, written in a dramatic, almost theatrical style like an adventure. One passage described their journey to a crypt, debating which grave to open before finally breaking in and sending one of them down inside. It read less like a confession and more like a performance, like they weren't just committing the act, they were narrating it, romanticizing it, turning it into something bigger than what it really was. Which raises the question, was this ever about the occult at all? Or were they just trying to make themselves and their music seem more interesting? When police began questioning the group, the answers only made things more confusing. John Mylott admitted to making instruments from human bones for experimental music. He told police he used complete skulls for looking good and damaged ones for making drums. Alan English said the idea had started as curiosity. He admitted they had discussed how interesting it would be to take a skull before breaking into a tomb and taking several. He had planned to make models of the skulls to make into masks. He later said he was sorry for the trouble caused, but didn't regret the experience itself. David Stewart claimed the skulls he had were for artistic reasons. But in his home, police found a handwritten manuscript documenting their grave raids like an adventure story. Not just what they did, but how they wanted it to be seen. And when it came to the occult, Mylott himself dismissed it, telling police it was all just rubbish, which is an interesting defense. When you're surrounded by altars, black magic symbols, incense, robes, and human remains. Another revealing statement he made to police was that he thought that the church would have been more bothered about the grave robbing than the police. When you take in the fact that, when he would open his front door, he would be faced with the Westgate Hill Baptist Church, just a handful of steps in front of him. And when you think of his comment, it's almost like he was expecting a response from the church like a misbehaving child wants a response from their parent. So what was the motivation for these disturbing acts? On one hand, the early 1980s saw a surge in interest around the occult. For some, it was about control, identity, a way to push back against traditional structures, especially religion. On the other hand, this looked a lot like performance. A group of young men experimenting, not just with music but with image, with shock, with taboo, building something that felt extreme, mysterious and different. Because let's be honest, making music is one thing, making music with human bones? That gets attention. But here's the problem. Whether it was belief, rebellion, or just an attempt to seem interesting,
Do you think maybe he's compensating for something?
it came at the expense of something most people consider untouchable: the dead. And no matter how they try to explain it, that's not something you can dress up as art. The investigation eventually led to 5 arrests. What started as a series of disturbing reports had now become a full criminal case. Between them, the group admitted to opening graves and removing human remains. In total, at least 10 bodies, men, women, and children had been disturbed. In court, the details made it clear just how far things had gone. Bones and skulls had been taken across multiple nights. Some were altered, drilled into, and used as instruments. Others were kept, displayed, or simply left lying around. John Mylott, described as the central figure, admitted multiple charges of digging open graves and removing their contents. David Stewart and Alan English admitted similar offenses. John Smith and Sean Dower were considered less involved, but still took part. They only confessed to some of the grave robbing and did not admit to any that happened outside the Westgate Hill Cemetery. The defense argued it was about experimental music, atmosphere, creativity, that the bones were simply materials, part of an artistic process.
Bullshit.
But there's only so far that explanation can go. John Mylott, described as the linchpin of the group, was given 18 months in prison. David Stewart and Alan English were each sentenced to 12 months. Meanwhile, John Smith and Sean Dower, considered the least involved, avoided prison, receiving 160 and 100 hours of community service. The court accepted they were driven more by curiosity than control. But even then, the damage had already been done. Because outside of the courtroom, the damage they left behind had to be faced and repaired. The graves they had broken into weren't anonymous. They belonged to real families, people who had been laid to rest over a century earlier. One of the disturbed vaults belonged to James Baker, who died in 1858 aged 86. He had been buried alongside his wife, Mary Baker, who died in 1854. Their family vault also held relatives including George Baker and Patience Baker, as well as extended family members like John Ware, his wife and children. Another vault belonged to the family of Thomas Shaw, a prominent wine merchant, where he had been laid to rest alongside his wife Anne-Marie Shaw and their children. Their coffins once carefully arranged on shelves within the crypt. These were not forgotten remains. They were families, and now their resting places had been broken open, their coffins smashed, and their remains scattered. Even though the cemetery itself was not owned by the council at the time, they stepped in anyway due to the sensitivity of the situation and the very real danger the damaged vaults posed. Cemetery Superintendent Tony Whitwell took responsibility for overseeing the process, working alongside police to ensure the remains were handled with care and respect. Specialist craftsmen were brought in to carry out the work. Ian Woods, Arthur Fisher, and their colleague Bob Stewart. They were tasked with something few people would ever expect to do. They had to crawl into the damaged vaults. Inside, the conditions were grim. Coffins had decayed or been broken apart. Bones had been disturbed, removed, and in some cases, were missing entirely. The stone slabs that once sealed the crypts had been smashed and pushed down into the graves themselves, making access even more dangerous. Working in tight, unstable spaces, they carefully gathered what remained. But this wasn't simply a case of putting bones back. They had to identify them. Research was carried out into the families buried in each vault. Records were studied, burial layouts were examined, and a pathologist was consulted to analyze and trace features of the remains, helping determine, as accurately as possible, where each bone belonged. But even with that effort, the job was made far more difficult. Because the remains were no longer complete, what had been taken could not always be returned. Some skeletons were only partial, some bones were gone entirely. And that meant that even in restoration, there was a sense that something had been permanently lost. The work itself was slow, methodical, and dangerous. At any moment, the heavy stone slabs above them, already weakened, could have slipped, collapsed, and buried them inside the very vaults they were trying to repair. It reportedly took hours just to safely reseal a single grave, but eventually, piece by piece, the vaults were restored. The remains were placed back as respectfully and accurately as possible. The graves were sealed once more, and those who had been disturbed were finally laid back to rest. And so the question is, were they driven by belief, curiosity, rebellion, or were they just playing a role trying to build something shocking enough to make people pay attention? A group of young men chasing identity, experimenting with music, image, and taboo, until they went too far, crossed a line most people wouldn't even go near. Because it's easy to call something art, it's harder to explain it when real people are involved. Families, names, lives that had already been laid to rest, only to be disturbed again over a century later. And maybe that's what lingers most about this story. Not the symbols, not the instruments, but the fact that, for them, this was worth it. And no matter how they try to explain it, some things can't be rewritten. Some things shouldn't be touched. If you found the story as disturbing as it is fascinating, feel free to drop your thoughts in the comments. And make sure to subscribe and like the video for more real cases that are stranger than fiction.